Mixed results in the U.S. midterm elections. The Republicans tighten their grip on the Senate, while the Democrats capture the House of Representatives. What does this mean for President Trump's remaining 2 years in office? And how will it affect his foreign policy? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Mohammed Jamjoom. The midterm results set the stage for what promises to be a very different Washington for the second half of the president's first term in office. And there could be consequences for his foreign policies. The Democrats will have more power to influence decisions, from Russia and Saudi Arabia to the Israel-Palestine issue. We'll have an expert panel to discuss this shortly. But first, Rob Reynolds reports on the shape of things to come.
It was a big day yesterday.
White House spin zone. Despite the midterm loss of the House to the Democrats, President Donald Trump declared victory, citing Republican gains in the Senate.
I did focus on the Senate, and we had tremendous success with the Senate.
Democratic House Leader Nancy Pelosi said the Democrats' victory was an opportunity to work together with Trump.
We will strive for bipartisanship. We believe that we have a responsibility to seek common ground where we can. Where we cannot, we must stand our ground.
Control of the House gives Democrats power to block much of the Republican legislative agenda and launch investigations into Trump's Russian business dealings, taxes, and other ethical issues dogging several senior officials.
We as Democrats are here to strengthen the institution in which we serve and not to have it be a rubber stamp for President Trump.
Many Democratic voters believe the House should begin impeachment proceedings against Trump. But the Senate Republican leader had a warning for Democrats drawn from Republicans' own experience.
I remember when we tried it in the late 90s. We impeached President Clinton. His numbers went up and ours went down, and we underperformed in the next election. So the Democrats in the House will have to decide just how much presidential harassment they think is good strategy. I'm not so sure it'll work for them.
There's not very much common ground between the parties on major issues like immigration and health care. So the forecast for the next 2 years is lots of talk, but little action. Rob Reynolds, Al Jazeera, Washington.
All right, let's bring in our guests. Here with us in the studio is Karl Widerquist, political philosopher and associate professor at Georgetown University. In New York, Eli Clifton, fellow at Nation Institute and contributing editor at Lowblog. And in Boston, Rami Khouri, senior fellow at Harvard Kennedy School. Welcome to the program. So, Karl, let me start with you. Now that Jeff Sessions has been fired, not really a surprise, but how much do you think that could impact Robert Mueller's investigation?
Well, it depends what Trump has planned. He's already Whitaker, the replacement, is somebody who's very anti the investigation. Whether they're going to follow through and try to fire Sessions or not remains to be seen. That's a strong possibility, but we don't know what's in Trump's mind.
Rami, let me ask you, what about Russia overall? I mean, do you think now that the Democrats have taken control of the House of Representatives and have much more power to investigate, do you think that we're going to be seeing a lot more investigations as far as Trump's possible ties to Russia?
For sure, we're going to see investigations. We're going to see requests for classified or private material like bank accounts or tax returns and things of that nature, which the committees, the intelligence and other committees in the House have the authority to do without necessarily seeking Senate approval. There will definitely be probing going on now in the next month or so as people try to figure out what's the most effective way to push back against the many things that Trump has done that the Democrats don't like, but not to push too far when they might trigger a counter reaction both in the Congress and also among the public. So, for instance, there isn't really a majority in the population for impeachment of Trump. Many Democrats would like that, so that's probably not going to happen. But yes, there's going to be investigations, and there's going to be a lot of pressure using the constitutional system, new bills and passing new motions and new initiatives, new investigations, new hearings, all kinds of things are going to be done. Russia is going to be one of them. Syria probably will be one. Iran possibly. Certainly Saudi Arabia and Yemen and the fallout of the Khashoggi situation. All of these things will be on the agenda. The question is where they're going to prioritize things. Arab-Israeli issues will be pretty minor right now, but they'll eventually emerge later.
Eli, if you could expand a bit on what Rami was saying there, because he brought up Saudi Arabia. So if we could pivot a bit more to the region. And when it comes to Saudi Arabia, of course, we know that President Donald Trump is very close with the Saudi regime, but with growing outrage over the murder of Jamal Khashoggi and with Democrats in control of the House, is that relationship going to be affected?
I think the relationship with Saudi Arabia is probably a great example of the two competing, perhaps, aspects now of the president's foreign policy decision-making. At one level, members of his administration who work on foreign policy matters, such as the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, National Security Advisor John Bolton, they're almost certainly going to be spending a lot more time on Capitol Hill testifying before congressional committees, explaining the president's foreign policy decisions. So in that sense, there's going to be a lot more oversight. There's going to be a lot more pressure coming down on them to confront the challenges such as the murder of Jamal Khashoggi and many other of the inconsistent aspects of the United States' relationship with Saudi Arabia, extending to the war in Yemen in particular, where there's large-scale opposition within the Democratic Party to the U.S.'s ongoing role in helping to facilitate that through refueling as well as arms sales. But there's another side of this, which is that the president's legislative agenda is almost certainly stalled at this point. His ability to get anything through this democratically controlled Congress is going to be severely hampered. And foreign policy might be one of the few areas where he can act out, where he can provide distractions, something he is not above doing, as he showed with the trying to fan racist fears about the migrant caravan coming up through Mexico. And in that regard, it's quite possible he'll double down on the relationship with Saudi Arabia and the backing of MBS.
Karl, I think one of the key words that Eli was mentioning there is oversight. The fact that the Democrats have the House, are they going to hold Trump's feet to the fire on a number of issues? Now, one of them I want to ask you about is Yemen. Of course, one of the things that's come out of the growing outrage that we mentioned in the murder of Jamal Khashoggi is the fact that there is this momentum, seemingly in Washington, to try to hold the Saudis accountable for what's going on in Yemen and to perhaps try to stop U.S.'s relationship with Saudi Arabia when it comes to the war in Yemen. Do you see that being impacted at this point?
Yes, I mean, they are going to be able to shine a light on what's going on. That's one of the roles of an opposition, and the way the U.S. system works. You can control the House of Congress and still essentially be the opposition. They'll be able to shine a light on some of this stuff, and they can block a lot of legislation that would have gone through the otherwise. That's all they can do. And it's true, they face the big trade-off of how much of this can they do without going too far. I think in the past, Republicans have been very willing, very unafraid of going too far when they're doing things like this. And Democrats have been a little more, maybe a little over-afraid about going too far. And maybe they need to go a little farther this time.
Rami, what do you think about, when it comes to this issue of Yemen? I mean, do you think that we're at a stage now that U.S. lawmakers will effectively be able to block the U.S.'s participation with Saudi Arabia in the war in Yemen in some way?
It's the low-hanging fruit in the American-Saudi relationship, and it's the easiest thing for the United States to do, to send a message to Saudi Arabia that comes out of the widespread anger and revulsion in the U.S. About the Khashoggi murder. And not just the murder of Khashoggi, but the repeated lying and incompetent explanations coming out of the government of Saudi Arabia and the Crown Prince's office. They keep coming up with different stories. So there's really strong offense and anger in the United States, and they want to do something to just send a message to Saudi Arabia. And the easiest way to do this is Yemen, partly because there's also incredible information now with photos on the front page of the New York Times and other places about the terrible human catastrophe.
Yeah, Rami,
in
I
Yemen.
mean, in the U.S. right now, you're seeing the news about the humanitarian catastrophe in Yemen really playing out in the media in a way that it wasn't before, correct?
That's right, and people don't vote because of foreign policy, we know that, but at the same time, polls show that Americans want their government to be even-handed, to be decent, to have integrity, to promote international law and fair-handedness to both sides in the conflict, including the Arab-Israeli conflict. So there can be public opinion pressure, possibly pushing some of the members of Congress to at least get the United States to stop directly being involved in this war, and then maybe they'll move on to other things like delaying weapons sales to Saudi Arabia, renegotiating issues like that. So the American-Saudi relationship is so big and so significant that they don't want to bring it crashing down, obviously, but they also want to send a message.
Because it is possible that the Democrats in the House will completely ignore Saudi and Yemen because they might decide that they will get more attention focusing on the Russia investigation and some of Donald Trump's financial dealings or his past sexual harassment issues. They might decide we can only focus on so many things, and they might make the calculation that those are the things that they can the most focus on. Maybe they'll drop some of those and spend more time on Saudi and Yemen. It remains to be seen.
Eli, if we're talking about Saudi Arabia and we're talking about Yemen, we should, of course, bring Iran into the conversation. Now that the U.S. is reimposing sanctions against Iran, where does this relationship go? You know, there have been so many reports in the past year that perhaps Donald Trump wants to reopen negotiations with Iran. From your vantage point, does that happen? What happens next exactly?
I would find that to be an extremely unlikely outcome because there's one actor in this midterm that we haven't really given any attention to, and when I say we, I mean the media in general, and that is the Republican Party's biggest donor, Sheldon Adelson, alongside his wife, Miriam Adelson. And, they put over $100 million into this election cycle. You could argue that it was a blunder and that it was a huge loss for them because of the outcome for the House. But they did okay in the Senate. And more importantly, I might argue that actually their investment into Republican House races still could pay a dividend to them because their number one concern is foreign policy. It's keeping a hawkish U.S. stance toward Iran. They're very close with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. And by all accounts, that is their primary motivation for their political giving, has to do with maintaining this close relationship between the Republican Party and the Likud Party in Israel. And Sheldon Adelson arguably has more influence. This is a party that is more deeply indebted to him. Any Republican member of Congress, any Republican member of the Senate, and Donald Trump himself all owe arguably their positions to Sheldon and Miriam Adelson's largesse in helping to fund them. Now, Adelson has proposed in the past that the U.S. negotiating strategy toward Iran should be to drop a nuclear weapon as he put it, in the Iranian desert and tell the Iranians that the next nuclear weapon will be landing on Tehran. This is not somebody who wants to see any sort of negotiation or diplomacy. He helped fund the opposition to the negotiation of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action under the previous administration. And by all accounts, he played a major role in pushing for John Bolton, a thorough Iran hawk who nobody would doubt his intention of trying to spark some sort of a conflict as being appointed as National Security Advisor to Donald Trump.
Eli, sorry to interrupt you. It's just
on Iran, it's hard to imagine.
Eli, sorry to interrupt you. It's just I see Karl wants to jump in and make a point here. Go ahead, Karl.
Yeah, and don't forget, spending $100 million in an election is not just an investment on the outcome of that particular election, but it is buying continuing influence with that party. I'm sure that's obvious to you, but I wanted to make sure I point that out. It's not just about a short-term investment. Even if they lose a lot of seats here, by spending all that money, they buy influence with Republicans for the next 2 years.
Eli, go ahead. You wanted to say something.
Precisely. I think that's absolutely right. And that is the key takeaway we should be making, is that Sheldon and Miriam Adelson have increased their investment into the Republican Party, and the Republican Party's ties to their biggest donors have now been deepened. So I think on foreign policy matters in particular, there's going to be very little daylight between any Republicans and where Sheldon and Miriam Adelson want them to be.
Exactly.
Rami, so let me ask you then. Of course, you heard Eli, and he brought Israel into the conversation. And you and I have on this show in the past spoken about this supposed deal of the century that Donald Trump, Jared Kushner, and others were going to bring to end the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, peace for the region. That has not materialized. Most analysts don't think it will. Where is all that? Where has that gone?
Well, the deal of the century is really the fantasy of the century. I mean, this has been a catastrophic century for much of the Arab world, certainly for the Palestinians. And it started with Balfour in 1917, and now we have Kushner in 2017-18, and two figures who have absolutely no interest in giving any kind of human rights or national rights or respect to Palestinians. And what we've seen over the century is total disdain by most Western powers, other than lip service, to a genuinely equitable resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And this deal of the century is built on a fantasy of the Saudis and the Israelis and moderate Arabs and Americans and others making a front against Iran, and it's just not going to work. Now, I would just like to add to what my two colleagues said before. We really have two contradictory forces at work here. One is this incredible impact of Sheldon Adelson, and then, of course, Jared Kushner and his links to the Likud and his total control in many ways, or heavy control of policy in the Middle East, in the White House, and the Christian fundamentalists. We just had a delegation of Christian fundamentalists meeting with Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince in Saudi Arabia. That triumvirate really creates a very powerful bloc that is driving much of the policies in the Middle East. Against that, though, is the tradition, the current of the last 10, 15 years, which is especially seen in the House of Representatives, and we saw it in this election with elections of many progressives, the first Palestinian American, Somali American, a lot of women and people, 3 Arab Americans, but many progressives, many leftist progressives. And what we saw in 2016 with Bernie Sanders is you can take a fair position on Israel-Palestine in public as a presidential candidate and not get destroyed like had been the case in the past. So I expect to see within the Democratic Party in the Congress more lobbying for even-handedness. That's all we're asking for. That's all they're asking for. And this is going to push back Adelson and Kushner and the Christian fundamentalists. It's going to create a really fascinating dynamic. The question is this important enough for them to make a priority, or are they more going to be focused on Russia, on Syria, on Yemen, Iran, human rights, or other issues? We'll just have to wait and see. But clearly there's two contradictory forces at work here, and this election brought out the progressive leftist forces.
Karl, I mean, Trump has been all about America first. Do you see him now, after these midterm elections, actually focusing more on foreign policy?
Yes, that's a traditional thing for presidents to do when they lose control of Congress. Is the one thing that they have most control over is foreign policy. So it's going to be a big assert for him. And when he says America first, he says the same thing Putin means when he talks about Russia. It's not really about America or Russia. It's about me first. It's about showing what a dominant and great guy he is. And he's got a lot of opportunities to bully people around in the foreign policy theater, and he'll do that. He also has an opportunity with the Senate still on us. If he'd have lost the House and have lost the Senate and kept the House, he wouldn't be able to appoint judges. That's going to be a big thing in this. That's going to be his main domestic thing in the next 2 years, is appointing every conceivable judge he can in all levels.
Eli, President Trump, he has severely altered, some would say harmed, America's relationship with the European allies. So, leaders in Europe, what are they taking? What is their takeaway from Democrats regaining the House? Are they happy about it?
I think Karl just pointed out that typically a president who's just lost midterm elections turns to foreign policy in the second half of their term. And in this case, I doubt you're going to see a different Donald Trump. You're not going to see a different Mike Pompeo. You're not going to see a different John Bolton. If anything, I would warn anyone who's dealing with them that there's a highly likelihood that in some ways they're going to feel like the leash has been taken off. They no longer have the midterm elections hanging over them. They no longer have many of the more moderate voices in their own party trying to pull them back from whatever they were trying to accomplish. And in terms of what their agenda will be going forward, I think as you just raised, while Iran is a good example, they're moving forwards with trying to unilaterally reimpose sanctions, including on or getting other countries who had signed on to the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action to now follow this unilateral move by the United States to re-sanction entities that engage in trade with Iran. There will be an effort by the Europeans to try to create a non-dollar-based exchange, so to continue some degree of trade with Iran and hopefully maintain some of the constraints from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action on Iran's nuclear program. But this is all going on in the context of John Bolton as National Security Advisor, who hasn't seen a multilateral or international treaty that he hasn't wanted to tear up. So the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty is almost certainly on the chopping block at this point, and I'm sure that there will be heightened tensions as Europe tries to salvage what they can of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action.
And as we do this, as the United States does this, it reaches a point where it overplays its influence. The United States leadership are acting like it's still 1945 and we are still the only intact industrial economy in the world, and that we can unilaterally sanction people and that will hurt them. It is hurting less and less. Unilateral sanctions coming to the United States is hurting less and less, especially with Iran now, with Europe trying to undermine it. The U.S. then has to try to pressure European companies and Chinese companies into making a choice between doing business with the United States and doing business with Iran, and that weakens the United States' influence around the world. Some of these companies are going to say, okay, I won't choose the United States, and then that a little bit erodes U.S. influence, and this actually what seems like a strengthening of U.S. power is actually over the medium and long term just weakening it.
Just to jump in quickly, to follow that thought, there's now an actively organized effort among big powers all over the world, Russia, China, Turkey, Europe, to organize a pushback against the American sanctions on Iran, to figure out a way where the world can keep trading with Iran. So the United States is dealing with opposition within the U.S. and then big opposition in the world. This is not a bunch of small little countries, but the biggest powers are saying to the U.S. openly, what you're doing is unacceptable and we're going to push back against it. The last point I make is that there are many Democrats who support the Trump position on Iran, for instance, or Palestine. And the new chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee in the House, Eliot Engel, is a Likudnik anti-Iran hawk, as hawkish as they come. So it's not all in the Democratic Party. Not everybody is against what the Trump administration is doing. And this is part of the struggle.
Mm-hmm. Karl, did you want to reply to that?
Yes, and this effort to this effort of Trump to get what he thinks are better deals is he doesn't know what these deals are for. Yes, the U.S. has always paid more for NATO than everybody else in NATO has, and that is because the tacit deal has always been the United States pays the most and the United States makes most of the decisions. Many of our trade deals are similar to that, and Trump trying to get what he thinks are more equal terms is actually spending America's influence, and it's weakening America's power.
All right, gentlemen, we have run out of time, so we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks to all our guests, Karl Widerquist, Eli Clifton, and Rami Khouri. And thank you, too, for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Mohammed Jamjoom, and the whole team here, bye for now.